Today's podcast of Hellbent for Horror is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Hellbent for Horror. Audible has over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Hi, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror. I'm S.A. Bradley, and I'm a lifelong movie lover, but my heart belongs to horror. My biggest thrill, however, is getting to talk to people about this stuff. I really want to start conversations with you. And welcome to a special edition show of Hellbent for Horror. I don't usually do movie reviews, I usually do stories, but I just came back from watching Blair Witch, the sequel to the 1999 original film. This one is directed by Adam Wingard. You're probably like me, maybe, when you first heard that they were doing a sequel to Blair Witch 15 years later, you may have gone, When I heard that Adam Wingard was going to be directing it, I kind of went, we'll see how that goes. Because Adam Wingard is one of the new breed of filmmakers that are out there doing horror that I think is pretty good. He's directed You're Next. That's probably his most famous and popular movie that he's done. He also did some really good low-budget movies, A Horrible Way to Die, as well as The Guest. And he also did a few sequences in the VHS series. I think if you really look at his movies, all of his movies would have been at home in the drive-ins. If it was just 30 years earlier, I think Adam Wingard would be considered a drive-in maestro. He makes the types of movies that fans would recommend as hidden gems. But in the world of Netflix, he's competing with a whole bunch of other stuff. And I think that in a weird way, it kind of works against him. With that said, I had some hope for this sequel because I feel that Wingard usually is pretty imaginative. He comes up with a way to put a shot together that seems very interesting. He tends to have ideas of situations that are a little bit fun as well. So I was going, maybe he can bring something to this that would work. He's also part of a low-budget group of filmmakers that I really admire. They're all making horror films. They all pretty much in one way or another come from the Larry Fessenden Glass Eye Pick school of thought. Ty West would be one, Jim Mickle is another. And all of these guys are making some really interesting movies. So if anybody was going to make a decent pedigree of Blair Witch, it might be one of these guys. However, he's making a sequel to Blair Witch Project. So there are problems in making a sequel to a movie like Blair Witch. Highly original movies, in other words. Highly original and influential films. And Blair Witch Project most certainly falls into that. Whether you love it or hate it for its influence, Blair Witch not only revitalized horror at a time when it really needed it, but it also created its own substructure of movies, an underground kind of film known as the found footage film. Now, it is influential and original. It's not the first original and influential horror movie that came down the pipe. And if you look at history, you'll see that every time a horror movie is original and influential, it is very, very hard to make a sequel for those movies. Other horror films that broke the mold of the times with their originality, one would be The Exorcist. It pushed the limits of what we considered obscenity. It pushed the limits of what the audience was able to endure in tension. It gave us a new look at childhood. It gave us a new demonic baby. There had been evil kids before, but there hadn't been anything quite like Reagan. And you also had this tension of religion being put in this at a time when religion was first feeling the first blows of it not being as influential in American society. With that said, The Exorcist spawned a million low-budget ripoffs, and it had a really bad sequel, Exorcist 2. Exorcist 3 made up for it, but that was decades later, and I would say that Exorcist 2 was just really bad because it tried to be original in a way that I think you'll see many of the great horror films that are original. When they try to make a sequel, they try to break away from what made it original in the first place, and that doesn't always work. Now, with that said, there's another type. That's Jaws. Jaws really is original and influential because of how it tells its story. The visuals of Jaws were groundbreaking. As simple as it may seem, that water level camera angle, as well as that soundtrack, gave character study without you having to see the character. And that was pretty original at the time, especially, in the rubber suit monster era. You also had the idea of the ocean as the creature under the bed. Well, really, the ocean itself is the bed, and the shark is the creature under it. And that really hit on a primal level for people. Now, what that did, because you're not seeing the shark, and you're having a big area as the bed where something could hide, it spawned a million low-budget killer fish movies, and many, many bad sequels. I know some people like some of them. I'm not one of them. I'm sorry. What I'm getting at here is Blair Witch Project is another in this line of films. It is hard to replicate lightning in a bottle. Originality that had influence. It is very hard to do something where you are actually extending, instead of creating something new, extending the originality of something. Now, how was Blair Witch so original? Well, horror itself was in a decade-long slump. I mean, we had thrillers that ruled the earth, and any horror movies that were coming out, they all pretty much had the same glossy Scream look. Scream became a very big hit, and in its own way revitalized horror a little bit. But what it did was it created an ability for movie companies to create clones. You throw in some teen heartthrobs, very good glossy look, PG-13 rated kind of horror, and we had that repeating over and over, whereas Scream was pretty good. Then you had I Know What You Did Last Summer and several others that I can't even remember because it just wasn't that exciting to me. Then you had, of course, what I guess I'm getting at with that is the gloss and the way that it looked very much like high-end stuff. You had high-end PG-13 horror, and it was kind of boring. And that's where you have the Blair Witch Project come in and be pretty subversive, pretty revolutionary in its own way. It's kind of an experimental film. It's experimental horror film. And here's where, yes, I'm going to say it. It is very much like Italian neo-realism. So I am going to say that the Blair Witch Project is the Rome open city of horror films. Basically, if you look at Italian neo-realism, what they were doing was stripping the artifice of film and trying to go towards a more documentary feel so that you would have pure emotions. They started to realize, the Italian neo-realists, that because of Hollywood filmmaking, which looked great, people were being trained how to look at movies, and spontaneity was going away. You had the dolly shot, you had the perfect, what they call Paramount lighting, you had sound that was going to be the same, you had the same kind of actors, everybody started to look the same, and Italian neo-realism said, no, we're going to pull all of that away. We're going to have handheld camera. Obviously, there's a little bit of that in Blair Witch Project. And there's a lot of similarities in what they did in Rome Open City and what they did in Blair Witch Project. We'll stick with Blair Witch. Just assume that pretty much if you look up Rome Open City, you'll find the same thing. So one of the big things, no musical soundtrack. You have some soundscapes that are in the beginning of the film, and there are soundscapes at the end of the film, but for the most part, you're listening to natural sound coming from two different sources, one that is a video camera and one that is a 16 millimeter film camera. They have slightly different sounds to them, and that takes away gloss right there. Sound men in any film would be like, I can't believe they actually allowed that to happen. But what it does, because we have been trained so much by the way that horror movies were being made at that point, this felt very real. You're kind of pushed in a way to think of this as real. Of course, a caveat to that, one of the big reasons that it felt real was it was the first viral marketing film on the internet, at least, where people felt that there was already a mythology in place. Some people actually felt that it might actually be real. So you have that plus no musical soundtrack to make it feel real. Then they're using natural lighting, and that's exactly what Italian neo-realism did. In other words, there's no stage lights. They walk into a room, how it's lit is what the room is going to look like. They go into the woods, there's no weird lighting and obscure shadowing that's going on. It is what it looks like. During the day, it's that. When they're in the car, it's that. And they actually have handheld cameras going along with that, for better and for worse. They had the actors actually do that. And that helps make it more realistic as well. It's very much documentary style. But because they're not cinematographers, they're not going for the old tropes that you see in horror films. So just like the neo-realists saw that people were trained to look for certain things in films and therefore kind of cutting out the emotions, in this movie, experimentally, Sanchez and Myrick are doing the same thing. You have the actors not putting, say, like a big example is there's a whole bunch of space behind someone while they're talking. The camera's kind of skewed in a way that there's a lot of empty space behind them. You know somebody's either going to jump out from there or you're going to see something in the background, so your eye is already going there. The actors don't do that. They're not making those kind of shots, so you don't have that predisposed idea of what's going on. Helps really make it feel as if it's actually happening. Another thing is natural locations. Minimal set design. So you have a little bit of set design in the old house at the end in the original Blair Witch Project, but for the most part, what you see is what you get. And as simple as that sounds, it's got to be really hard for filmmakers to not try and meddle with things. And having everything natural, the sound, the lighting, the cameras, the locations, all of that coming together makes it feel real. It felt real because everything around the story, which is the supernatural part, and the actors was real. And that falls into what Stephen King used to talk about for real horror. He felt that horror is at its best when everything in the story makes logical sense, except for the supernatural thing. You have a better chance of accepting it. It also sticks out quite a bit, and you're focused on it. But the thing is, if the world is real, if the reality of what you're creating, everything seems to follow the laws of physics and etc., it allows the supernatural to be scarier because it is existing inside of a real world. So there's that made the original Blair Witch Project very influential. Another way, and the way that I think is the best, is that the movie relied heavily on the audience's imagination. At that time, when we're talking about the late 90s, early 2000s horror, most horror films were what I call show and tell. You get to see everything as an audience member, and you know everything. You are told everything. You're visually told, and in the story itself, they're telling you. You're just waiting to see how it's going to work out. And that's fine, and there's nothing wrong with that. At the time, it was a little bit played out because everybody was showing and telling the exact same thing. But Blair Witch was all setup and suggestion. There's a minimum amount of information that's given to you in any scene, and the rest is what you brought to the setup in your head. And a lot of that is your own memory, and that's where natural locations come in. What I think is really smart, and it was probably because they couldn't afford anywhere else, but hey, it works, is that they show the woods as the kind of woods everybody knows. Anybody who's ever been in a rural area has probably been in woods that looks like this. It's tall trees, but not really menacing trees. Mostly it's scrub. There's a bunch of leaves. There's rocks, and there's just hills after hill after hill. Now, that's something that's really interesting because we're used to cinematic woods. Even The Witch has very cinematic woods. This is very commonplace woods. It makes the story universal, and it kind of falls into that Stephen King thing. Everything looks real. The thing that is unreal is going to feel a little bit real as well. But really, the most important thing that made the Blair Witch Project work so well was a very real sense of dread that started with about 15 minutes into the film and didn't relent until the very last shot. And unfortunately, that's what's missing in the new Blair Witch. a sense of dread. Now, Adam Wingard and the writers, they tried to add new wrinkles to Blair Witch to make it as original as possible. I mean, they obviously had thought about this, that they did not want to do a very pale repeat of the first movie. They didn't want to just go along those same standard lines. They wanted to dress it up a little bit. And they knew that all the things that were original in the first Blair Witch were now pretty much tropes and cliches because there's been a ton of found footage movies and they all tended to go towards the things that were the least memorable about Blair Witch. In other words, they saw the big impact, but they didn't get the subtlety or that dread. And because they knew that all these things that were original are now kind of tropes and cliches, they put in their own stuff, but they also knew that you need to make a Blair Witch movie a Blair Witch movie, right? If you're doing an original, innovative film, and it's known for its originality and its innovation, it can't look like every other horror film that's out there. So what they did is they tried to both honor those tropes that there are in Blair Witch world and also give them an updating. And I think that's where we have a problem. They did not see the forest for the trees, not trying to really make a joke there. They overthought it. In other words, there are ideas that sound good in meetings, writing meetings, and on paper. And when they're putting everything in pre-production, they've got themselves a really cool gotcha, or so they think. It just doesn't work cinematically. Now, this is a spoiler alert. If you haven't seen the movie yet and you want to go in clean slate, stop now, because I'm going to dissect a few things, and I'm not going to care whether or not you know the plot, and I'm not going to care whether or not you care about any of the scares, what little there are. So, quick plot. The brother of Heather from the first movie sees a YouTube video of newly discovered footage from the expedition from the first film, and it seems to show that his sister may still be out there or alive. So he goes out into the woods with friends and cameras to try and find her. Very simple plot, and I applaud it for being a very simple plot. That's what's going to work in a movie like this. You don't need to make it terribly complex. But it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And there are a couple different reasons that I think that it doesn't work. What I want to start with is some of the updating. One of the biggest updates that just doesn't work is updating the multi-camera perspective, which obviously everybody knows what the multi-camera perspective was in the original Blair Witch. And in this one of the reasons that they have this updating of the multi-camera perspective is because you have to update for technology, and you also have to try and get people into the story. And one of the ways to do that is there's always the guy who's watching the movie who goes, I would never be in that situation. If I was going to go into the woods and I knew that there was something dangerous, I would have a GPS so I couldn't get lost. I would have extra batteries. I would have walkie-talkies so we could always talk to each other. So, of course, they're going to put all of that in the film because what you want to do to try and create a sense of dread is say, you could do everything right and the woods are still going to get you. So in this movie, everybody has earpiece cameras with a GPS in them. I think that's just a terrible idea, but they ended up doing it. So everybody's camera shot is at ear-eye level. You know, there's no difference between them. There's also a drone that they have that can fly way up there and get us a big, big view, and then you can see the expanse of the woods. And allegedly, with what their use of it is that you'll be able to find either the way out or you'll be able to see anybody who's lost in the woods. So you have technology all over the place. There's a digital SLR camera. Now, it ups the ante because even with all the modern equipment, they're still going to get lost. The witch is still going to get them, right? But the problem is everything looks exactly the same. Everyone's camera point of view is the same. It's the same digital clarity. The shots are all at ear level. And what this does is really make everything repetitive. Now, the first film, very smart, whether they intended it for this reason or not, it's a very smart choice because they had a black and white 16 millimeter film camera, and you had a regular video camera, high-end but still video camera. So each view was distinct. There was a fingerprint to what these look like. They were different grain, they were different style, different coldness. The characters, in other words, whoever's holding that camera, they now have a visual tag to them. You can tell who was who visually. Those two different styles also helped break up the monotony because they had different textures and different feels. It also kept me from puking, I think, because for me, the video was really, really shaky. And I think it's because it was a lighter camera. And the 16 millimeter was a little bit more steady. So going from that, quote, film reality of 16 millimeter to, quote, video reality, I was able to have not only a monotony break, but also an equilibrium break. So you have that kind of thing happening inside of the first film, but it's missing in the new one. Everything looks exactly the same. The shake is going to be the same from person to person. The only way that you know who isn't filming. That's all you know, because you can see the person in front of them running away, but you can't figure out who the person is that you are at that point, whose point of view it is. And that's really kind of a problem. Now, the biggest twist that's in the movie, the one that I think they went, all right, we've got it. We're going to have something that's original, and it's going to pay homage to Blair Witch, but we're going to make it something else. We're going to expand that myth. That biggest twist that should have been cool is actually what kills the movie. And what this is that when night falls, the sun never comes back up. So we aren't sure if days are going by or if it's all one night. There are characters that are really nothing more than red herrings. They suggest that days have passed, that everybody is in some kind of supernatural time loop. Now, that sounds much cooler than it really is. And unfortunately, what this does is it kills all the dread in the film. Now, the first movie got a lot of its dread from a very simple pattern. Day, night, day, night. During the day was all set up, and you could see the woods. So you get a sense of place, you get a sense of location. Even if you don't know where you are, you know what things look like, and that memory is going to be important. And the repeating of that from day to night to day allows you to continue to see whether there's progress or there's no progress, whatever it is, but you get some visual information. So in the day setup, you could see the woods. Even if you're lost, it gives a sense of place. But then at night, everything would go crazy. Anybody who's seen the movie knows what crazy is. So at the end, in the darkness, you only see what the flashlight is illuminating. So that is disorienting. And you have people running and screaming, and that is disorienting. But then you'd go back to the day. And when you would go back to the day, the second time, dread is starting to build up. And the dread would build because you know night is coming again. And you know they need to get the hell out of the woods. And you're watching them be futilely unable to do so. They continue to come back to the same place. And that is bringing dread because you have a timer on you. The movie is not necessarily showing nightfall coming, but you're feeling nightfall coming. And that's a sense of dread. You know that what's happening is going to get nasty once it gets dark. And so even if nothing is happening per se, on the shot that seems particularly scary, you're already tense because you know time is being lost. And you also had emotions for each person. You don't have a lot of character development. It's not necessary. It's actions that allow character in movies like this. And in this, you got mad at least once at every person that's in the movie. Every character, you're like, why did you do that, you idiot? And you also had at least one moment where you felt bad for them. So you're having empathy for these characters, even if they're not supremely King Lear-like developed. You're still getting some emotions. And I have to say, the new one, you just don't have that. The new one is all in the dark. So you have nothing but disorienting flashlight shots. You have nothing that tells you location. You have no sense of place. There's constant running or hiding. People are constantly splitting up. And they have way too many shock jumps. In other words, people looking around and all of a sudden one of the characters jumps up and the other person goes, don't do that. You can do that once or twice, but really they're relying very heavily in this film on that. And all of the shots look the same in the dark, all of them. So that means that there's no buildup. There's no release. It sounds good to say this is just all the night shots, all the stuff that was scary in the first one, all the night shots. It's going to be, no, it's not scary without the buildup. It's not scary without the dread that's coming in the day. So in the nighttime, it's just pedal to the metal. It's up to 11, and that is noisy, first off, but it also gives you no time to think and no time to feel. And that's a killer for something like that. And there is, I mentioned noise. There is entirely way too much yelling and screaming because of this. There is no contrast. Day, night, quiet, loud, nothing like that in the way of contrast. Now, in the original, there's some screaming and there's some fighting during the day, but there's not much during the day. So you're getting a break. Sometimes people are just sobbing, and quiet is a beat. And that beat is missing inside of this film. And this movie falls on that so much, the idea of screaming. And they fall into my pet peeve. The thing that drives me the craziest about any found footage movie is the people saying stuff when they're scared. What the fuck? What the fuck? Over and over again. What the fuck is that? What the fuck is that? That happens in one shot, a very, very famous shot of Blair Witch Project. But that is repeated often through all of these found footage movies. When you are scared in the woods, in reality, and you think you're being stalked in reality, this is the noise you make. You go silent. You crouch, ready to jump like an animal, and you're quiet. And this is just so common in found footage films. Not only that, they also have the problem, because it's improvised, most of this, they have the problem of people saying stuff when they should be quiet, and they're also saying what they're doing or thinking. So they're in the tent. Did you hear that? Yeah, I heard that. Did you hear that? Yeah, I heard that. We heard that. Are you going to go out there? Yeah, I think I'm going to go out. Let me open up the tent. Oh my God, look out there. Do you hear that? Just go out there and listen. It's really bad filmmaking. It's really, really terrible writing when you have someone say what they're going to do and then they do it. You just do it. Movies are moving. It's motion. And it's not as if this is groundbreaking stuff, but many of the found footage movies, like I said, go on improvisation. But the thing about Blair Witch is it feels like it's scripted. These guys act like they're actors. So this was really disappointing from Wingard to have all of this screaming and all of that weird exposition that happens when movies are normally improvised. Now, Paranormal Activity, it's not like these movies can't do this. Paranormal Activity did it right. When things were happening, when they would hear a sound, when something would move or open, the people would freeze and listen. Their eyes would be moving all over the place. The camera would be still. Our eyes are moving all over the place. And that really, really worked. There's no reason that it can't be done that way. It's intelligent stuff. It doesn't mean that there's a vacuum if people aren't screaming, I'm going down the hall, while they're going down the hall. So, this new Blair Witch seems to forget about the many times that all you heard in the first film was hyperventilating, or gasping, or crying. Once again, the movie recreates over and over again Heather Donahue's famous "What the fuck is that?" which was improvised. She actually saw one of the filmmakers in a bush, and she couldn't help but mention it. And it became a very chilling moment, but it's not something that works if you continue to replay it. Now, back to it being all night in the new Blair Witch. The idea of that. There's no idea the sense of place. Even if you are just seeing it in the daytime and you don't know what you're looking at, you at least have a mental image of hiding places when it is dark and there are just this little pinpoints of light. You can see corners in the darkness because you've mentally had the repetition of what the woods look like. But when there is no sense of place, it's just confusing. So instead of feeling like the unknown in those black spots, to me, it just became tedious, not knowing where anything is. I felt like a very old man. What's going on in here? Why is everything so dark? Why is that thing shaky? I was actually getting annoyed as opposed to getting more tension built up. Really, the only time this movie finds its energy is when they get to the witch house at the end. And even that, until they get inside of the house, they're breaking rules of the original Blair Witch left and right. One of the big ones, when you're dealing with a movie that's kind of like Italian neo-realism in its own right, why would you light the house and have fake lightning and fake rain in a movie that's trying to seem as if it's real? It took me right out of the film. But I was so glad when they got inside of the witch house, because that's where it finds its energy, because it's almost like it's a kid with ADD and somebody finally gave it its Ritalin. Gets inside of the house, and now the cameras are forced to follow the lines of the walls, and they have to see the doors and recognize the doors, and you can see empty doorways ahead of you, and you get nervous. You're focusing on certain things. We're not going all over the place. We're getting visual information, and we start getting nervous. And at that point, I started feeling the fire in my belly from the movie. I'm like, oh, here we go. Maybe we're going to get somewhere here. I mean, you start to worry about the bends in the hallway. You know there's more than one person in the house. You know, all of that stuff is happening. And they even do an effective use of the barely seeing a figure before they disappear around a corner. What that does, seeing that person around the corner, is it creates suspense. It creates dread. It is still only seeing so much, but it is all in context at this point, and it's what hasn't happened in the film up till now, because it has just been in the darkness and shaky and all digital and all ear level and all screaming. The scariest moments, really, in the film are when the camera is absolutely still. There's a moment when the characters are in underground tunnels, and the tunnels are getting thinner and thinner and narrower and narrower. And then one of the characters gets trapped, stuck in the cave, and they drop their camera, and the camera rolls, and we're looking at her from the camera. And we can't see behind her, and she's sobbing. And that stays on her for a while, and that's when we start really feeling dread. But the best moment of dread is actually in the final moments of the film. The final character is literally staring at a wall in the corner of a room, and she turns the camera towards herself to try and see what is behind her without looking behind her, because she's been told that if you look at the Blair Witch, you die. But then the end result is also disappointing. It is a pale, complete recreation of the last moments of the first film, and it just feels empty. It's a reminder of a much better film. Now, the new Blair Witch, it just outthinks itself. It changes the things that were critical to the original success, and it keeps the most irritating things about the original. The first Blair Witch was so original, and it was so impressive for audiences and influential for filmmakers, because it subverted the cliches of horror films that were running rampant at the time. And unfortunately, the new one ends up trying to be subversive by adding all the cliches back in. And that's my review of the new Blair Witch. Thanks for listening to my show. I'd love to hear back from you. You can email me directly at scott@hellbentforhorror.com. For you, the listeners of Hellbent for Horror, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/hellbentforhorror. If you like the show and you're curious about audiobooks, sign up for the service through Hellbent for Horror. It helps make this podcast sustainable for me, and I thank you in advance. And thanks for listening. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. If you like the show, please consider writing a review on iTunes or Google Play. It really helps. Thanks a lot for listening. You can now subscribe to the Hellbent for Horror podcast. It's now available on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. You can also keep up with Hellbent for Horror on iTunes at iTunes Podcast. That's on Twitter. You can find more on our Facebook page at facebook.com/Hellbent for Horror, and I'm on Twitter at Hellbent Horror. You can also find more info on my website, hellbentforhorror.com. Till next time, stay hellbent.